The morning mist hung heavy over Florence as Niccolò Machiavelli walked through the narrow cobblestone streets, his mind churning with observations that would later reshape humanity's understanding of power, discipline, and the nature of human will. It was 1513, and the former diplomat found himself in exile, stripped of his position but not of his penetrating insight into the mechanisms that separate the disciplined from the defeated, the strategic from the scattered. In the quiet of his study at Sant'Andrea in Percasina, surrounded by the works of ancient Romans and contemporary Italian politics, Machiavelli began to understand a fundamental truth that would echo through centuries: discipline is not merely a virtue to be admired, but a weapon to be forged, sharpened, and wielded with surgical precision. The man who would become synonymous with calculated power was about to unlock the secrets of mental fortitude that could transform any individual from a victim of circumstance into an architect of destiny. The candle flickered as he dipped his quill into ink, beginning what would become not just the Prince, but a comprehensive philosophy of human transformation. What emerged from his observations of Cesare Borgia, the Medici family, and the rise and fall of Italian city-states was a blueprint for creating unbreakable mental discipline, a forge in which ordinary minds could be hammered into instruments of extraordinary will. The foundation of iron will. Machiavelli understood that most people live their lives as subjects rather than rulers of their own destiny. They react rather than act, respond rather than initiate, and drift rather than drive toward their objectives. This fundamental weakness, he observed, stemmed not from lack of intelligence or opportunity, but from an absence of disciplined thinking and systematic approach to personal development. The first principle he established was the concept of virtue, not virtue in the modern sense, but a combination of skill, strength, and strategic thinking that enables an individual to shape circumstances rather than be shaped by them. This virtue, Machiavelli realized, could be developed through deliberate practice, much like a blacksmith forges steel through repeated heating and hammering. Consider how Machiavelli himself demonstrated this principle during his exile. Rather than wallowing in bitterness or accepting defeat, he transformed his isolation into an opportunity for deep study and reflection. Every evening, he would don his finest clothes and enter his study as if attending court, treating his intellectual work with the same ceremony and respect he had once reserved for diplomatic meetings. This ritual transformed mere reading into a sacred practice of mental discipline. The key insight that Machiavelli discovered was that discipline is not about suppressing natural impulses, but about channeling them strategically. Just as a river becomes more powerful when its flow is directed through a narrow channel, human energy becomes exponentially more effective when focused through the lens of disciplined purpose. He observed that successful leaders throughout history shared certain mental characteristics. They could delay gratification in service of larger goals, they could think several moves ahead like chess masters, they could maintain emotional equilibrium during crisis, and they could adapt their tactics while never losing sight of their strategic objectives. These were not innate talents, Machiavelli concluded, but learned skills that could be systematically developed. The process begins with what Machiavelli termed the conquest of the self. Before one can hope to influence external circumstances, one must first establish dominion over one's own thoughts, emotions, and impulses. This internal sovereignty becomes the foundation upon which all external achievements are built. Machiavelli's approach to developing this self-mastery was revolutionary in its practicality. Rather than relying on abstract philosophical principles, he advocated for concrete daily practices that would gradually reshape the mind's default patterns. He understood that the human brain, like any complex system, operates according to habits and patterns that can be deliberately modified through consistent application of new behaviors. The first step in this transformation involves what modern psychology would recognize as metacognition, the ability to think about thinking. Machiavelli encouraged individuals to become observers of their own mental processes, noting when their minds wandered, when their emotions hijacked their reasoning, and when their impulses led them away from their stated objectives. This self-observation must be conducted without judgment or self-criticism, which only creates additional mental turbulence. Instead, it should be approached with the detached curiosity of a scientist studying a fascinating specimen. The goal is not to immediately change these patterns, but first to become fully aware of them. As Machiavelli documented his observations of various political figures, he noticed that those who achieved lasting success had developed the ability to pause between stimulus and response. When faced with challenging situations, they did not react immediately based on emotion or impulse, but took time to consider their options and choose their response strategically. This pause, which might last only seconds in urgent situations or days in complex scenarios, became the crucible in which disciplined decisions are forged. It represents the moment when an individual transcends mere reaction and enters the realm of conscious creation of their experience. The development of this pause requires systematic training, much like developing physical strength requires progressive exercise. Machiavelli recommended starting with low-stakes situations and gradually building the capacity to maintain composure and strategic thinking under increasing pressure. For instance, one might begin by practicing this pause when stuck in traffic, using the frustration as an opportunity to observe the mind's tendency toward impatience and practicing the deliberate choice of calm acceptance. Over time, this same skill can be applied to increasingly significant challenges, difficult conversations, professional setbacks, or personal crises. The ultimate goal of this training is to develop what Machiavelli called flexibility of mind, the ability to adapt one's approach while maintaining unwavering commitment to one's fundamental objectives. This flexibility is not wishy-washy inconsistency, but rather the strategic agility of a master fencer who can change tactics instantaneously while never losing sight of the goal of victory. The architecture of mental sovereignty. As Machiavelli delved deeper into his analysis of power and human nature, he began to understand that true discipline required more than just individual willpower. It demanded a complete restructuring of how one approached daily life, relationships, and long-term planning. The disciplined mind, he realized, was not simply a mind that could resist temptation, but a mind that had been systematically organized to generate power and effectiveness in every sphere of existence. The foundation of this mental architecture was what he termed the principle of concentrated energy. Machiavelli observed that most people dissipate their mental and physical energy across dozens of competing priorities, desires, and distractions. Like sunlight scattered across a wide area, this diffused energy produces little heat and no fire. However, when that same energy is concentrated through the lens of focused intention, it becomes capable of burning through any obstacle. This concentration of energy required a radical reassessment of how one allocated attention, time, and resources. Machiavelli advocated for what would later be recognized as a form of strategic minimalism, the deliberate elimination of activities, commitments, and even relationships that did not directly contribute to one's primary objectives. This was not mere ruthlessness, but rather a recognition that in a world of infinite possibilities and finite resources, the disciplined individual must make conscious choices about where to invest their most precious assets, time and attention. Every yes to one activity necessarily represented a no to countless others, and the disciplined mind must learn to make these choices strategically rather than reactively. Machiavelli's own life provided a perfect example of this principle in action. During his exile, rather than attempting to maintain his previous social connections or pursuing multiple small opportunities for employment, he concentrated his entire focus on the systematic study of power, politics, and human nature. This single-minded dedication during a period of apparent failure laid the groundwork for his lasting influence on human thought. The practical application of this principle begins with what Machiavelli called the audit of energy. This involves conducting a thorough assessment of how one currently spends their time, attention, and emotional energy across a typical week or month. Most people, when they undertake this audit honestly, are shocked to discover how much of their life force is being drained by activities that contribute nothing to their stated goals and values. The audit must extend beyond obvious time wasters like excessive social media consumption or television watching. It must also examine subtler forms of energy dissipation, maintaining relationships that consistently drain rather than energize, engaging in mental habits like worry or resentment that produce no positive outcomes, or pursuing activities that provide temporary pleasure but undermine long-term objectives. Once this audit is complete, the disciplined individual must begin the systematic process of energy reclamation. This is where Machiavelli's strategic thinking becomes essential, because simply eliminating negative activities creates a vacuum that must be filled with positive ones, or the old patterns will inevitably reassert themselves. The process of reclamation must be gradual and strategic. Machiavelli understood that dramatic changes, while emotionally satisfying, rarely produce lasting results. Instead, he advocated for incremental adjustments that compound over time, much like the gradual erosion that eventually carves the Grand Canyon. This might involve replacing one unproductive activity per week with something that advances one's objectives, or dedicating just 15 minutes per day to a new habit that supports long-term goals. The key is consistency rather than intensity, building momentum that becomes increasingly difficult to stop. As these positive changes accumulate, they begin to create what Machiavelli termed the upward spiral of discipline. Each improvement in one area of life generates energy and confidence that can be invested in improvements in other areas. The individual begins to experience themselves as someone who follows through on commitments, who makes consistent progress toward goals, and who has the capacity to shape their circumstances rather than merely react to them. This transformation in self-perception is crucial, because it shifts the individual's identity from victim to creator, from someone who struggles with discipline to someone who naturally embodies it. This identity shift makes future discipline choices feel natural and automatic rather than requiring constant willpower and internal struggle. Machiavelli also understood the importance of what modern psychology calls environmental design, structuring one's physical and social environment to support discipline choices rather than undermine them. The disciplined individual does not rely solely on willpower to make good choices, but instead creates conditions that make good choices easy and bad choices difficult. This might involve physically removing temptations from one's environment, surrounding oneself with people who model and support disciplined behavior, or creating systems and routines that automate positive behaviors. The goal is to reduce the number of decisions that require conscious willpower, preserving that limited resource for the most important choices. The disciplined mind also develops what Machiavelli called strategic patience, the ability to delay immediate gratification in service of larger, long-term objectives. This patience is not passive waiting, but active investment in future outcomes through present sacrifice and effort. Machiavelli observed that this strategic patience was perhaps the most crucial distinction between those who achieved lasting success and those who experienced temporary victories followed by long-term failure. The undisciplined mind seeks immediate pleasure and relief from discomfort, while the disciplined mind willingly accepts present discomfort in exchange for future advantage. The development of strategic patience requires a fundamental shift in how one evaluates choices and outcomes. Instead of asking what will make me feel good right now, the disciplined individual asks what choice will best serve my long-term objectives. This shift in questioning automatically leads to different decisions and, over time, dramatically different outcomes. This long-term thinking must be balanced with what Machiavelli termed present-moment effectiveness. While maintaining focus on future objectives, the disciplined individual must also remain fully engaged with current circumstances and opportunities. The goal is not to live entirely in the future, but to make present choices that serve future objectives while remaining responsive to current realities. The crucible of character. In the final phase of his analysis, Machiavelli turned his attention to the ultimate test of discipline, how an individual responds to crisis, setback, and apparent failure. He recognized that anyone could maintain disciplined behavior during periods of success and smooth progress, but only those who had forged true mental toughness could sustain their commitment when everything seemed to be going wrong. The events of Machiavelli's own life provided him with ample opportunity to study this phenomenon from the inside. His fall from political grace, exile from Florence, and temporary imprisonment could have broken his spirit and ended his intellectual contributions to history. Instead, these setbacks became the raw material from which he forged his greatest insights into human nature and the mechanics of power. This transformation of adversity into advantage, Machiavelli realized, was not a matter of positive thinking or emotional suppression, but rather a fundamental reorientation of how one interprets and responds to challenging circumstances. The disciplined mind, he discovered, possessed the ability to extract value and learning from every experience, regardless of whether that experience was initially perceived as positive or negative. This reorientation begins with what Machiavelli termed the sovereignty of interpretation. While individuals cannot always control what happens to them, they retain complete authority over how they interpret and respond to these events. This authority, when properly understood and exercised, becomes the source of unshakable inner strength and resilience. The undisciplined mind tends to interpret setbacks as evidence of personal inadequacy, unfairness of life, or reasons to abandon difficult goals. The disciplined mind, by contrast, automatically searches for lessons, opportunities, and strategic advantages that might be hidden within apparent disadvantages. This different interpretive framework is not mere optimism or denial of reality, but rather a practical approach that maximizes the value extracted from every experience. Even genuine failures and mistakes become valuable sources of information that can prevent future errors and improve decision-making capacity. Machiavelli's analysis of various historical figures revealed that those who achieved extraordinary results often experienced extraordinary setbacks early in their careers. However, rather than being defeated by these challenges, they used them as training grounds for developing the mental toughness and strategic thinking that would later enable their greatest achievements. The process of developing this resilience requires what Machiavelli called deliberate exposure to difficulty. Rather than avoiding challenging situations, the disciplined individual gradually increases their capacity to handle stress, uncertainty, and discomfort by voluntarily engaging with progressively more demanding circumstances. This might begin with small challenges like taking cold showers, maintaining difficult physical exercise routines, or engaging in uncomfortable but important conversations. The goal is not to seek suffering for its own sake, but to build confidence in one's ability to handle whatever circumstances might arise. As this tolerance for difficulty increases, the individual begins to experience a profound shift in their relationship with fear and uncertainty. Rather than being controlled by these emotions, they learn to use them as sources of information and energy that can be channeled toward productive action. Machiavelli also understood that sustainable discipline required what he termed the cultivation of worthy obsession. The individual must develop such deep commitment to their primary objectives that the pursuit of these goals becomes intrinsically rewarding, regardless of external circumstances or immediate results. This worthy obsession serves as an inexhaustible source of motivation that can sustain disciplined action even when willpower fails, emotions fluctuate, and external support disappears. It transforms discipline from an exhausting battle against natural impulses into an exciting adventure toward meaningful achievement. The cultivation of such obsession requires deep clarity about one's fundamental values, purposes, and vision for their life. Without this clarity, discipline becomes mere self-denial, which is ultimately unsustainable. With this clarity, discipline becomes self-expression, the natural manifestation of who one chooses to be and what one chooses to create. Machiavelli's method for developing this clarity involved what he called the dialogue with mortality. By regularly contemplating the finite nature of life and the limited time available for achievement, the individual naturally begins to prioritize what truly matters and eliminate what is merely superficial or socially expected. This confrontation with mortality is not morbid dwelling on death, but rather a practical tool for maintaining perspective and urgency. It serves as a constant reminder that time is the most precious resource, and that disciplined use of this resource is the only way to create something of lasting value. As the individual develops this long-term perspective, they begin to experience what Machiavelli termed the detachment of the strategist. They become less emotionally reactive to daily ups and downs, more capable of making decisions based on strategic considerations rather than immediate emotions, and more resilient in the face of criticism or temporary setbacks. This detachment is not emotional numbness or withdrawal from life, but rather the calm confidence that comes from knowing one's direction and having developed the skills necessary to navigate toward it regardless of changing external conditions. It is the mental state of a master craftsman who knows their tools, understands their materials, and trusts their ability to create something beautiful regardless of the challenges that might arise during the creative process. The final element in Machiavelli's system of disciplined development was what he called the multiplication of force through influence. The disciplined individual, he realized, could achieve far more than their personal efforts alone might suggest by developing the ability to inspire and direct the efforts of others toward common objectives. This influence was not manipulation or coercion, but rather the natural result of embodying the principles of discipline so completely that others were naturally drawn to follow and support the individual's vision. When someone demonstrates unwavering commitment to worthy goals, maintains composure under pressure, and consistently follows through on commitments, they naturally become a source of stability and direction that others want to be associated with. This multiplication of force through influence creates what Machiavelli termed the compounding returns of discipline. The individual's disciplined actions not only produce direct results, but also inspire others to contribute their efforts toward the same objectives, creating exponential rather than merely linear growth in impact and achievement. The development of this influence requires what Machiavelli called the integration of being and action. The individual must embody their principles so completely that their character becomes their strategy, and their strategy becomes their character. There can be no separation between who they are and what they do, between their private thoughts and their public actions. This integration creates an authenticity and power that cannot be faked or manufactured through techniques or tactics alone. It represents the final stage of discipline development, where disciplined behavior becomes as natural and automatic as breathing, and the individual becomes a living example of what focused human will can accomplish when properly directed and sustained over time. As Machiavelli put down his quill and looked out at the Tuscan countryside, he understood that he had documented more than just political strategy or personal development techniques. He had mapped the fundamental process by which any individual can transform themselves from a passive victim of circumstance into an active creator of their destiny. The path he had outlined was not easy, but it was proven. It had been walked by every individual throughout history who had achieved something of lasting significance, and it would continue to be walked by those who refused to accept mediocrity as their fate. The forge of discipline, once lit, burns continuously. Each day provides new opportunities to strengthen the will, refine the focus, and advance toward worthy objectives. The individual who commits to this path discovers that discipline is not a burden to be carried, but a power to be wielded, the power to shape not only their own life, but the lives of everyone they touch. In the end, Machiavelli realized, the choice between discipline and its absence is the choice between freedom and slavery, between creation and mere reaction, between a life of significance and a life of regret. Those who choose the path of discipline choose to forge their mind into an unstoppable force that can overcome any obstacle and achieve any goal that human will and strategic thinking can accomplish. The morning mist had lifted from Florence, and the sun now shone clearly on the path ahead. The forge was ready, the tools were prepared, and the raw material of human potential awaited transformation. All that remained was the decision to begin, and the commitment to continue until the work was complete.